How's it going, folks? In this video, I'll be covering the introduction and chapter 1 to Rodolfo Acuña's book, The Making of Chicano Studies in the Trenches of the Academy. As a side note, I should point out that Rudy Acuña is often regarded by many as one of the fathers of Chicanx studies or Chicano studies. He wrote many books like Occupied America, A History of Chicanos, Corridors of Migration, which is one of my personal favorites, and many other books. And this was just one of his most recent books, which is called The Making of Chicano Studies. I'm not going to be covering these two chapters in their entirety. Here I'm going to be focusing on the points from the reading related to the mission of Chicano Studies and the historical foundations of the discipline. So for starters, Chicano Studies, or Chicanx Studies, does many things. In part, we learned that Chicanx Studies seeks to challenge anti-Mexican and anti-immigrant xenophobia. Today, much of this xenophobic rhetoric survives through media outlets like Fox News and anti-immigrant laws like Arizona's SB 1070. So in part, the mission of Chicanx Studies is to, and I'm paraphrasing, to quote, break down ethnocentrism through the introduction of knowledge of Mexican people in the United States, end quote. Unfortunately, in recent decades, Chicano studies in colleges and in K-12 education have also been attacked as un-American. In Arizona, lawmakers passed the Anti-Ethnic Studies Bill, HB 2281, which attacked the Raza Studies program in Tucson. Despite political pundits' claims and attacks on Chicanx studies as a detriment to educational success, data collected has shown that students in Arizona public schools who took ethnic studies courses performed better than their counterparts in standardized exams. So, in part, Chicanx studies seeks to improve educational attainment, but Chicanx studies also sheds light on Mexican American experiences in the US. And as a result, Chicanx Studies checks these claims made by political pundits. It is also an important discipline because, frankly, Chicanx peoples make up a significant portion of the US population and are expected to grow in the coming years. But what makes Chicano studies different from other disciplines like Latino studies or Latin American studies? A major difference is that the discipline focuses on the experiences of Mexican and Mexican Americans in the US. Granted, a point that I would like to add to this is that Chicanx studies disciplines across the nation today do offer courses that study other groups and geographic regions outside of the US. Another important point from Acuña is that, quote, the primary purpose of the area of Chicano studies is to teach students and advocate for the interests of the Chicano community. As the first chapter of his book demonstrates, the early scholarship of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the US later evolved into the foundations of Chicano studies. Although Chicanx Studies has succeeded in its mission to establish itself as a discipline, its goal of improving access to higher ed for the Chicanx Latinx population has been threatened in recent years. Budget cuts to education nationwide and rising college tuition costs push Chicanx and Latinx students out of school. The goal of Chicanx Studies of promoting cultural diversity and cultural competency has been undermined by a resurgence of xenophobia and violence against immigrants. Next, let's move on to some of the points on Chapter 1, Becoming Chicano Studies. An underlying theme studied in Chicano Studies addresses, quote, what it is like becoming Mexican and Mexican American. Chicanx Studies has explored the evolution of what Acuña refers to as a, quote, identity crisis for the Mexican and Mexican Americans living in the US. These identity crises, or crises I should say, are a product of the colonial Spanish caste system and also the US war with Mexico. Identity debates continue today, right, as we've seen in debates regarding the use of terms like Chicana, Chicano, Latina, Latino, and Latinx. Primary sources written by Mexican Americans in the US show that they also had used many different terms to refer to themselves, depending on their state, region, or community. And hint, as a side note for those of you writing research papers, Acuña does mention and cite some of these sources, some of these primary sources in this chapter that might be of use. So take a look at those footnotes, citations, and those newspapers mentioned in italics. Chicanx studies also responded to the greater education crisis in the US, Southwest, and greater United States. There were severely low literacy rates, and although many states and local governments passed compulsory education laws, they were rarely enforced. In New Mexico, Mexican Americans sought alternatives to the public school system by attending Catholic schools, but the Catholic school system came under attack from Protestant opponents in the 1860s and 1870s who called for a secular education that taught American values. Of course, not all US Americans and Protestants were xenophobes. Others, like the Protestant minister Reverend Robert N. McLean, supported Mexican and Puerto Rican communities in their efforts to help their children obtain an education. Since the late 19th century, Mexican children who attended public schools were separated from white American students. As a consequence, at least half of the Mexican American students were segregated in what were then called Mexican schools. This practice lasted into the early 20th century. During World War I, xenophobic American policies required Mexicans and Mexican Americans to speak English only. The administrators of these schools also notoriously crafted IQ tests that, by design, placed students of Mexican heritage in remedial programs. In the 1920s, we also witnessed the early beginnings of scholarship focused on Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the US. For example, there was Manuel Gamio, a Mexican anthropologist who published works on Mexican immigrants. The Tejana Jovita Gonzalez de Mireles composed folklore on the South Texas Rio Grande Valley, and the early works of George Sanchez studied and proposed a bilingual curriculum for Spanish-speaking students. And by the 1940s and 70s, he became a, quote, activist scholar who advocated for bilingual education and improving education. To again paraphrase Acuña, George Sanchez was also key in introducing Chicano studies to higher ed as an area of investigation. After World War I, veterans of color who participated in the war effort still lagged behind white Americans in educational attainment. The GI Bill did, in theory, provide opportunities for veterans to go to college. The problem was that in places like California, which created the state college system, the Chicanx, Latinx, and Black American populations were less prepared than white Americans to enter college. For that matter, Black and Latinx Americans did not make it past the 7th grade. However, to say that the Mexican American and Latinx population were complacent to these problems is false. Locally, parents protested their marginalization and the segregation of their children. The Puerto Rican and Mexican American couple, Felicitas and Gonzalo Mendez, took their case to the Supreme Court and won in the landmark case, Mendez versus Westminster School District. This ruling in 1946 declared the segregation of Mexican children to be unconstitutional. Notably, this case and many others were announced before the historic Brown versus Board of Education ruling, which ended segregation nationwide. So how does this history relate back to the making of Chicano studies? The scholarship from the 1920s and onward, again, set the stage for the multidisciplinary nature of Chicano studies as a discipline, and it has evolved ever since. So, today, if you take Chicano studies courses covering various fields like literature, history, folklore, psychology, arts, dance, and so on and so forth, right? This is something that we see today, right? Chicanx studies is very much interdisciplinary. This history also teaches us that at the very beginning, studies of Mexican American people were used for practical purposes. This sort of research informed public policy decisions or brought awareness to the problems that were faced by the Chicanx, Mexican, and greater Latinx community. Lastly, Acuña notes that, quote, becoming Chicano studies involved forming a common identity and considering separate and distinct cultures, as well as the formation of a community of scholars and the collection of data and interpretation, end quote. In other words, at the very beginning, right, this scholarship was focused on the unique needs of Mexican American, and Spanish-speaking people in the U.S. These scholars advocated for the unique needs of their communities, such as bilingual education. Also, thanks to the scholarship and activism dating back to the 1920s, we now have access to historic knowledge and data relating to Chicanx experiences going back to the 19th and 20th centuries. Into the present, Chicanx studies continues to build on this research and activism thanks to the foundations set by its predecessors.